And welcome to the final topic in our Kotlin language basics. The only thing that we have left to talk about is going to be classes and objects, and although this is perhaps the most complex section, as there are a ton of different topics we can cover, we'll try to jam everything into just 2 sections. The first section, which will be this one, is just going to be a basic intro into the concept of classes and objects. We'll talk about the 3 main components, fields, constructors, and methods, and then we'll cover how to instantiate classes and access those methods and fields and constructors. In the next section, we'll introduce the concept of subclassing and superclassing, and maybe even talk about access modifiers. After that, I think you'll have all the basic tools you'll need to know, but like I said, there's a ton more to talk about when it comes to classes and objects, so I would recommend you do further research after this. So for starters, we're not going to head to main activity right away. I'll just take a few minutes to talk about what classes and objects are. Well, we can think about an object as being some kind of a construct that has state and behavior. So this means it generally has some kind of attributes which we represent with variables or fields, and then it has some kind of behaviors which we can execute on that particular object. These are done through the use of methods and are generally speaking, although not always, used to modify the classes or the object's state. Now, objects are just a way to represent, and like I said, any kind of a construct, anything that will have that state and behavior within our code. They're generally designed to mimic a real-world object. For example, a piece of clothing could be represented as an object. Maybe something like a computer could be an object. Perhaps in the context of a video game character or an item would be an object. It's just going to be anything that will have attributes or properties that we'll want to keep track of, and that might actually do stuff. It might have some kind of behavior. We use constructors to create what are called new instances of objects. So this is basically to create a new object, and then we can populate some of the fields there. So the class is just kind of like a blueprint of an object. It's just the code implementation of an object that specifies what kind of fields it's going to have, what kind of methods it's going to have, and how those are going to operate, and then the constructors. So perhaps this will be a little easier to understand if we launch right into an example, and a good place to start would be to determine what kind of an object we want to simulate here. So one of the first things that comes to mind is just going to be an article of clothing. So we're maybe designing some kind of an app that deals with people's clothing, and we need some kind of a class to represent that, because clothing can have state and it can have some kind of behavior. So rather than again switching to main activity right now, we'll save that towards the very end. We're actually going to start by creating our own custom class in a new file. So let's go ahead and select the main package here. We're going to right click, select a new Kotlin file or class, make sure that a class is selected, and let's just call this one something like clothing. Okay, we'll select OK. And this will go ahead and create a new file and a new class within that file. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this comment. You can keep yours if you'd like. So note how it's added that down at the bottom here. It's added to our total list of files. So this is the name of our class. You can see that it has the word class here, defining that it is in fact a class. And generally speaking, we want to capitalize the name of each class. Now this will have a default constructor, which we can specify with the brackets here. We can also create other constructors, but I'll get into that in just a second. So before we start talking about constructors, perhaps it would make a little more sense to talk about the fields or the properties that this clothing class might have. So think about what kind of properties or state a piece of clothing would have, and this has to be generic to all pieces of clothing. Generally, there'll be a size associated with that piece of clothing. Maybe there'll be a color, a material, whether or not it's clean or dirty, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different attributes we can model here. I'm just going to pick a few of them. Perhaps we'll go for, we'll probably give this guy some kind of a name. So we'll have a variable name, which is going to be of type string. Okay, we're not going to initialize it just yet, so just ignore this error for now. We'll also have maybe a size, variable size, which is going to be of type integer. And we'll also have whether or not the piece of clothing is clean. So variable is clean, which is going to be of type Boolean. So I know, like I said, there's lots of other properties we could add, but we're just going to keep things really simple for now. So this would mean within our class we've specified there are 3 fields. Every single time we create a piece of clothing, it's going to automatically have these 3 fields which haven't been assigned values just yet. And there's actually errors for all 3 of them saying they have to be initialized somehow. So what we'll have to do is find a way to initialize them using what's called a constructor. A constructor is how we create new instances of a class, or basically new objects that this class represents, and we generally use this constructor to populate some, if not all, of our fields here. So Kotlin actually has a variety of different ways in which we can do this. We can specify just an empty constructor here and create a secondary constructor down here. But I think it's probably easier if we just create a primary constructor and just use that one, okay? So within these brackets here, we're going to specify the fields that we want to populate. We're just going to take in a name, which is going to be of type string, okay? And we're going to take in a size, which is going to be of type integer. Okay, note that the errors still haven't disappeared, and that is because we haven't set them in our constructor here. What we'll actually want to do, because Kotlin is a little weird in its syntax, is we can actually get rid of these, okay, and we can change these to variables here and variables here. So now what this has done is it's actually done that work of creating the fields for us and initializing them all in one go. So just to get rid of this error, actually, I'm going to default this to be true. Let's just default a piece of clothing to be clean, okay? So like I said, the constructor in Kotlin, like this kind of syntax, actually creates these fields for us. So now we do have a field already in here called name, and we do have a field called size, okay? Even though it's not explicitly stated up here, because we've created these variables in the constructor, this has set them up for us. Now, in a lot of other languages, you'll see something that looks a little more like this. We'll have a constructor, which will take in maybe a name as a string. It will take in a size as an integer, okay? And then it's just going to say something like this.name is equal to name, and then this.size is equal to size. Okay, so this is pretty typical syntax that you'll see in a lot of other languages. In fact, this is the only language I've seen this kind of setup in. So this is basically saying that my piece of clothing, every clothing class has a property named name and size, and it's saying the property called name that belongs to this clothing has this value of name, which we're passing in, and then the size has this value of size, which again we're passing in. So this is just kind of like a function in which we're taking in some parameters, and then we're just setting up the values for these two variables here. Now this is giving me an error, because it's saying that there's already a primary constructor. This is what's called a secondary constructor, because we have a primary and now we're creating another one. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to call upon what's called the super constructor. I know this is a little confusing, but we'll just basically pass in the name and the size here. Okay, so this is still going to be pretty much the same fields as this. So we'll actually take in is clean as well, just in case we want to automatically set that. It's going to be of type Boolean. And then we're just going to say this dot is clean is equal to whatever we pass in for the value is clean. Okay, so that gets rid of our issues there. So the way this reads, and actually we shouldn't need to include those because we're setting them up here. The way that this reads now is we have this constructor. So if we don't care about setting is clean or not, then we could just use this one. But if we want to use this alternate constructor, where we do want to explicitly set the is clean value, then we can take in the name, again, the size, and whether or not it's clean, and then we're calling on this constructor. So we're setting up the name and the size in this call, and then we're setting up whether or not it's clean using this here. All right, so I know it's a little bit of a confusing concept, and this is just kind of exploring a couple of different ways in which we can initialize classes using some Kotlin-specific syntax. Like I said, this is the only language where I've actually seen something like this, so it will take some getting used to. I'd recommend, if you're still kind of confused about this, then go ahead and pause this, try to think of some more scenarios, like do a little bit of practice on your own, and kind of walk through the motions to see exactly what's going on at each step along the way. Essentially, just think about this constructor as actually being two function calls, where we're still taking in the name, the size, and the Boolean, where we're taking in just the name and the size here, but we're taking on whether it's clean as well. And then we're making a call to this function, so we're setting up these two variables, then we're also setting up this third variable here, okay? So this is going to be the constructor. Like I said, these are constructors. These are going to be used to set up new instances of this class. So let's quickly implement some behavior so that we can check out this idea of creating new instances, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense. So what kind of behavior might a piece of clothing have? Well, a piece of clothing can't really do too much. It can be worn, it can be washed, but that's something. A piece of clothing can be washed. So we can change whether or not it's clean to true or false based on whether this piece of clothing has been washed. So maybe we'll just create some function here, which is going to be called something like wash clothing, okay? And all this is going to do, I know it's not a terribly interesting function, but it's just going to set this.isClean equal to true, okay? It's not going to bother taking in any parameters. Regardless of whether the item is clean when you put it in the washer, it's going to come out clean anyway. Alright, so if you can think about any other behaviors that a piece of clothing might have, feel free to implement methods and actually add more properties if you'd like. Just be aware that if you do create properties up here, you'll need to initialize them when you create them, or make them initialized in the constructor, or make what are called late init variables, which are just variables that will be initialized later on, okay? So with that being said, we're just going to stick with these three for now. I guess we have three fields, one method and two constructors, and let's take a look at how to create new instances of this class, or essentially new clothing objects. So we're going to go over to main activity, and again everything has to be done within some kind of a function. So in our case we'll just do it in onCreate. So what we'll do is we'll set up a variable or a constant, depending on whether we want this to be changed. I'm just going to create a constant because, like I said, we want to use those where possible. And we're just going to say something like t-shirt, t-shirt. This is going to be equal to a new instance of clothing, so we're just going to start typing in clothing, press enter, open up the brackets, and now there are two options. So you remember we created two constructors? Well, there are two possible constructors that we could use. We could just initialize the name and the size, or we could initialize the name and size and explicitly say whether it's clean or not. So it's entirely up to us which one we want to use. If we only had the one constructor, like we took this out, then we would only have, going back to main activity, we only have the one option to choose from, okay? I'd like to keep that second constructor in though, so I'm going to put it back. Okay, so let's say we want to give this guy a name, and we want to give it a size. So we're just going to give it the name, first of all a string, and then some integer value. So we'll give it the name of t-shirt. And let's give this a size of, I don't know, 6, whatever that means. This could be large, extra large, however we want to interpret this. So at this point, we've created a new instance, okay, of this class. We've basically created a new object that is a t-shirt object, and this is the type. Okay, so this is a weird concept. Usually, well, up until this point, we've only really studied primitive types and strings like integers, floats, doubles, strings, booleans, characters. This is actually of the type clothing. So it's of this own custom type that we created. Every object or every class that we create creates a custom type. So this is a new type here. So we have various fields and one method only that we can access from this class. So the way in which we do this is by calling on the name of the instance, in this case t-shirt, dot, and now we get access to all three of the attributes, whether it's clean, the name, and the size, and we also gain access to this method. So let's say t-shirt is clean, let's create a variable is clean, is clean, equal to t-shirt.isClean. In this case, we didn't initialize it, so its default value is true. Let's actually make that default value false. And then we'll go to main activity, and then we'll call t-shirt dot wash clothing. And at this point, t-shirt is clean is equal to true because we are calling on this method. So the way in which this works, and this is something that we maybe haven't seen before, is that these properties, the isClean, the name, and the size, belong to this instance of this class. So this means that if we call any methods on it, or we change the value from isClean to false from true, or we change the name or the size, then this instance's values get affected. So if we change this t-shirt isClean equal to true, then from then onwards, any time we call upon t-shirt.isClean, it's equal to false until, of course, we change it, right? Same with the name and same with the size. What this doesn't mean, however, is this variable, this value is still going to be false, okay? Because even though we're calling on the t-shirt to wash the clothing so that the t-shirt is clean, this is just capturing the value at this point in time, then we're changing the value here, so this actually doesn't change, okay? And that's an important concept to get down, is the fact that this is actually just pointing to the value at this point in time. This is just getting, or this is changing the value that belongs to this instance of the class, okay? So if you can understand that, then you actually pretty much have the basics of classes and objects down, and this final section should be a breeze to you guys. Unfortunately, like I said, I'm really going to have to try and hurry things along, so I'm going to end this section here. Let's just quickly review what we went over because it can be a little complex. So remember, classes are just a blueprint of an object, and an object is just some kind of entity within our program that is going to have a state or attributes, and it's going to have behavior that we want to represent through the use of methods, and then of course variables for the state and attributes. We create a new class like this. This is a primary constructor, and constructors are used to set up some of our variables here. Now we can use this constructor this way to set the variables up. If we don't put anything in the primary constructor, then we do have to actually create the variables up here like this. Okay. This is a secondary constructor, which is just taking in an additional parameter and setting up that additional variable, but has to call upon the primary constructor too. This is just a method, which is essentially just a function that belongs to a class here, and then this is just another field. We can use our constructors to create new instances. In our case, we had 2 to choose from, and we store the instance of a class inside of a variable that is of that particular type. So we can retrieve values from this and store them in other variables. Just note that they won't change. We can also modify this instance of a class's values through the use of these methods, or just by retrieving or setting values that way. Okay, so I know this is confusing, so please do try this stuff out. If there's any section in this tutorial that you try some stuff out on your own, this is really the section to do it. I would recommend definitely running and printing some stuff out, so that you can check up on values and make sure that you are understanding exactly what's going on. Once you're ready with, or once you're fully comfortable with this stuff, we'll move on to the next section, which will actually be the final one. There we're going to talk about subclassing and superclassing.